Good evening, or maybe good afternoon, depending on from where you're joining us for this uh, video conference. My name is Reinhard Bütikofer. I'm going to be your host for this webinar. And I am welcoming three very particular guests as our expert panel to discuss the US elections. And we will take a look at the mess that we have on our hands at the moment and how it might turn out. And of course, we're also interested in hearing about what our experts think concerning possible consequences for the transatlantic relations. Our three experts are Laura von Daniels. She is head of research division working on the Americas at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP. Welcome, Laura. We have Bruce Stokes, a very old friend of mine. Not saying you're very old, but we go back quite a while. He's executive director of the Transatlantic Task Force at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And we have Jeff Rathke, president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at the Johns Hopkins University in Washington. Welcome also, Bruce and Jeff. Each one of you will be invited to give introductory remarks. We'll kick it off with you, Bruce. And I would like you to address three different baskets of issues, basically. And you pick and choose your own priorities, but I would like to cover the election from different angles. So very simple first question, who will be president? What do you think? But maybe you also want to comment on voting patterns, on election surprises, or what you find surprisingly normal in this election. Maybe also looking at the Senate, the House, or the states, if you wish, and what will be the process over the next 79 days? What can we expect, or what should we expect? Second basket, looking at the broader picture. How does this election and all we're observing in this context reflect on the state of American society and the American political system? And what does it bode for the next couple of years? And basically also, then third, but not the least important, what are the prospects for foreign policy and in particular transatlantic relations? How much space will there be? As we might have divided government. How much space will there be as we have a divided society? What would be your optimal expectation, and what would be your most feared development in that regard? Okay. And we have a very good participation with people from think tanks, European institutions, from the business community, some people joining from Washington, from Brussels, from Berlin, quite a good crop and diverse audience. So please take it from there. Bruce, it's yours.
Thanks, Reinhard. It's really great to be with you and with everyone else, and I look forward to the other comments and also to the questions. But first, I want to show you, Reinhard, my mug today. It's I thought you might notice it and enjoy it from the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Look, if I knew who was going to win this election, I'd be in Las Vegas right now making money. The reality is we aren't sure yet. It it looks like Biden is on a track to win, given where we are today at 1:30 in the afternoon East Coast time. Um, uh, Wisconsin, he has probably won. They've just decided that in about the last hour. There are 600 votes to count, and he's ahead by 20,000 votes. Michigan is still up in the air, but they think they'll know by the end of the day, and he's leading. Pennsylvania will take days. Biden is way behind in Pennsylvania. But a lot of the votes still to come in are from Philadelphia and the surrounding suburbs, which should be good territory for Biden. And Georgia is still undecided, and there's a possibility, although Trump's ahead, that Biden could catch up. But I think most people think that's not likely to happen. So I think there is a prospect that Biden may win, but he may only win by 270 electoral votes, just the exact number he needs to win, which is not much of a mandate or an endorsement from the public. And of course, the irony is he could very likely win the popular vote, not by the some percentage points that Clinton won by and still lost the election. He could win the electoral vote and the popular vote by 3 or 4% and still barely just win the electoral college vote. So it is a commentary on the screwy way we elect presidents, that the popular vote is not really determinative, and it's not just that it's barely not determinative; it's hugely not determinative. I think the reason that Democrats are depressed today is not just that Biden is not doing as well as they had hoped. And privately, there was a lot of discussion among Democrats that they were going to win in a landslide, which didn't turn out. But it looks very likely that they will not win control of the U.S. Senate. And they will lose seats in the House of Representatives when, in fact, the best prognosticators thought they would win between 5 and 15 new seats in the House of Representatives. So at the end of the day, he may only barely win the presidency. The Democrats won't control the Senate, and they will have lost seats in the House. And that lost seats in the House should not be underestimated, because even though they'll still have a majority, it is typical in American elections that 2 years into a presidency, the party in the White House loses seats in the House of Representatives. So there's always the prospect that the Republicans could gain control of the House of Representatives in 2 years. So this has not been a great outcome for the Democrats whatsoever. But a win is a win. And if Biden wins, the value of being president is, you get to appoint the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Environmental Protection Agency who's in charge of toxic waste control. And you actually believe in controlling toxic waste as opposed to not improving. So there's power in winning, but we shouldn't overestimate that power. I think the biggest takeaway is that Trumpism lives in America, and it'll continue to define the Republican Party, even if Trump loses the presidency. Biden ran on a message that he could unite the country, but in the exit polling data, only 19% of voters said that was the most important candidate quality for them in choosing who to vote for. So only 1 in 5 Americans said, yes, I want a guy who can bring us together. So that Biden message and what he would have to do if he becomes president doesn't have a whole lot of support as a priority among Americans. I think the election merely confirmed what we knew and what we hoped wasn't the case, that there are really two different Americas. 3/4 of Trump supporters said national economic conditions were excellent or good, while 8 in 10 Biden supporters said they were not good or poor. So they live in two different economies. A majority of Biden voters, about 6 in 10, said the pandemic was the most important issue facing the country. Only 3 in 10 Trump supporters said the pandemic was the most important issue facing the country at a time when 1,000 people a day are dying and there are 50,000 people in the hospital from the pandemic. So again, we live in a different, two different realities. If you look at why it has been so close, Biden has lost support among Blacks. He still won Blacks overwhelmingly, but he's lost support compared to Clinton. He's lost support among Latinos compared to Clinton. While he's doing well among young people, he's up 8 percentage points among young people compared to Clinton. Trump won older people by 3 percentage points, even though he was down from 7 percentage points in 2016. So there is, Trump didn't do as well among older people as he might have. But Biden, on those middle-aged people from 30 to 44, Biden is down 3 points compared with Clinton. So it's a very mixed picture. The one that probably amazes me the most is that Trump, it would appear, won white college-educated women by 1 percentage point. Clinton had won them by 7 percentage points. So that was a shift of 8 percentage points among white college-educated women, which was a demographic that I think the Democrats just assumed was theirs. So I do think that is key. One issue that might be of interest to Europeans in particular is 66% of Americans on election day said that global warming is a serious problem. But if you look at the partisan break on that, it was 68% of Biden supporters said that, whereas 84% of Trump supporters said, no, it's not. So as we think about the issues that might affect transatlantic relations going forward, today the United States left the Paris Accord. Biden says he's going to rejoin it if he gets into the White House. Fine. But there is, there's very strong support among the people who voted for him to do more about climate. There's still a strong resistance among the people who voted for Trump. And if Biden doesn't have control of the Senate, any legislation that relates to climate change, a Green New Deal, anything that has to do with carbon taxation or whatever, is probably a dead letter, not going to happen. You think about the stimulus that's needed for the economy, because if the US economy has a slow recovery, then the rest of the world's going to have a slow recovery. The chances that you're going to get a big spending deal by the United States under a Biden administration, it seems to me, are going to be much more difficult now, because the Republicans, who for 4 years have thought debt wasn't an issue, I will bet you any money, will say now debt is a huge issue, we can't spend more money. So I do think that for a variety of reasons, the Europeans are going to find that a Biden administration is not going to be able to do many of the things they hope they'll be able to do. So I'll stop there.
Sorry.
Reinhard, can't hear you.
Yeah. So sorry, Bruce. I wanted to ask you one question regarding transatlantic relations, because you skipped that. Maybe you wanted to pick it up later, but is there scope for any new transatlantic policies beyond climate change that Biden might want to pursue, or will he be so consumed with the domestic issues that he can't even hope to find time for that?
I mean, that's a very good question. And I think that if he had won big, and if they controlled the Senate, the scope for maneuver would have been greater. I think that he was always going to face a problem of so many domestic issues to deal with that it was going to be difficult to do a lot of things internationally, except stuff he had to do. I think that initially it's going to be even harder now to do things with Europe. Now, there is a silver lining. When presidents eventually decide they get very frustrated with domestic issues, all of a sudden international issues become more interesting to them because they have more leeway to control stuff. But if a domestic, if he requires domestic support for some international issue, if it requires, I mean, just to take an example, my guess is Biden, if he's president, will try to re-engage with Europe on Iran. Fine. You know, renegotiate the JCPOA in some way. Obama did not put that before this U.S. Senate because he knew he couldn't get it passed. There's no prospect now. I mean, with the Senate we're going to have, that you would have that. So, will the Iranians agree to a new agreement with the U.S. and Europe on Iran on nuclear weapons, which is not a treaty? When the word of the United States in terms of just having an agreement seems to be something the U.S. can pull out of it at any time it wishes, I think that's going to make a renegotiation of the JCPOA more difficult. In terms of other things, I don't foresee under a Biden administration, or certainly a Trump administration, a bilateral trade deal. I mean, the task force I ran at the German Marshall Fund did recommend we do a mini deal on green goods and medicines and health goods, just as, you know, we could start there. Who knows whether that would even, because the reality is Obama didn't want to touch trade deals for his first 4 years because he didn't want to spend political capital on that. And I think we have the same problem possibly with Biden, only worse, because remember, Obama had control of the U.S. Senate for the first 2 years he was in power. It's looking very likely now that the Republicans will retain control of the Senate.
Thanks. That's not an exactly enthusiasm.
Well, one thing, Reinhardt, that we should underscore, given public animus towards China, and given the support Biden has in basic industry and in some of the labor unions, I could imagine that on China there's some opportunities for greater cooperation with Europe, because as you know better than I do, Europeans are probably more upset with China than they've ever been. And so there's something to work with there. So that would be one front where I think, and it's probably easier to do with Biden than Trump, simply because Trump is so offensive in so many ways to Europeans that cooperating with him is not that attractive. But if cooperating with Biden on China might be more attractive.
Well, finally, you found something that makes me hopeful. Thank you very much, Bruce. Lara von Daniels, I would like to call on you too. Same basket of questions. Please give us your perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much, Reinhard, and also Bruce, who already said a lot of things that make a lot of sense on the domestic situation in the US. I think I would just comment on the question on who will be president. I would say there is a good chance that Joe Biden will be next president of the United States. And I also would argue that the picture we see now is not terribly different or not as surprising. It's not that different from what many experts were actually looking at about a month and a half ago. I think in between you had this phase of huge optimism, people rooting for a landslide victory and so on for the Democratic Party. But if we go back in time about a month and a half ago, we had pretty much predictions that would tell us that it will be a narrow race. I think what is more or less surprising is not the presidency, the presidential race, but the narrow lead of the Democratic Party in the House. I do find that surprising. And also, just to pick one example, if we look at the Senate, the US Senate, I personally find it highly surprising that voters would confirm a senator like Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, who was shown, who's on tape saying things about the Supreme Court and then acting completely differently from what he 4 years ago told the public. But other than that, other than these particular outcomes, I think it's not that surprising. In terms of effects on American society, if we do end up in a situation where we have a divided government, indeed, I think it will mean more policy inertia. It will mean that, well, on the upside, you might argue that we will see less of a radicalization because of the institutions being divided. So there won't be room for radical conservative or progressive policy, which is something, I guess, that you already see in financial market reaction to these predictions. Wall Street seems to be very happy about this idea of having a divided government. But if you look at the negative side of it, it's pretty obvious that it will be holding up necessary structural reforms in the US. It will hold up, perhaps even make impossible a huge public investment program that was initially planned even by the Trump administration. You won't see much reform in the area of healthcare, and certainly not in climate policy, I think, simply because you won't have the majorities to do that, even if you have a President Biden. And what it means for foreign policy, I think, is also obvious. It gives us, not us, it gives the US government less maneuvering space. It gives Biden presidency less maneuvering space. And there will be only a very limited number of foreign policy projects that can actually be implemented at all. It will be a very, very small list of particular goals that President Biden could even aim for. And I think if you look at his program, if you look at his promises also to Europeans and other allies and partners, there's still some inconsistencies in his program. For instance, to me, it's not entirely clear if he promises to be supportive of multilateral institutions and to rebuild multilateralism. What is exactly the political priority here, given that at the same time he's also talking about a summit of democracies and about engaging with other democracies first, developing ideas of a group of very strong and economically potential democracies that will then lead the world. I think it's a question of setting a political priority. If you want to rebuild multilateralism at this point, you will have to work together with difficult partners or difficult countries like China. There's no other way of rebuilding the World Trade Organization or the World Health Organization without at least some kind of policy debate, engagement with difficult partners. And I think there will be some issues also in the US-EU relationship that will more or less remain constant no matter who will be president. Some of it has already been mentioned. But if we talk about these problems like Nord Stream 2 related US sanctions, if we talk about a new start for US or multilateral negotiations on Iran, I don't see, a lot of change just coming out of an outcome that puts Joe Biden in the presidency. I do hope that there will be more trade cooperation, but as Bruce and many of our colleagues already noticed or put down in very good policy papers, even in the area of trade, even in the transatlantic relationship, there's only very narrow space for narrow agreements, I think, at this point. And that's not entirely due to the US situation, the US political situation, but also due to concerns here in Europe. We've seen that in the whole debate about the transatlantic trade partnership, the TTIP, and that won't change, you know. So bottom line, I think obviously if we talk about a President Biden, at least we talk about policy options, we talk about priorities, we can talk about different approaches, but on the principles, I think we would agree much more than in the case of a continued Trump presidency. And leave it
Thank
there.
you. Thank you very much, Laura. Maybe one question on trade. We have these steel tariffs, we have the aluminum tariffs from Brussels and from Berlin. We've been arguing for ever since they have come into force that these are illegal. Would you expect President Biden to go back on that, or would we have to expect that they would just stay in place? And the second question to you, follow up. I mean, Biden did make some concessions in the electoral platform to the more progressive Democrats, to the Warren and Sanders camps. Now, he doesn't seem to be, if he ever gets it, to be in a position to deliver. How do you think that will play out?
Well, on the metal tariffs, I think, I think there needs to be some kind of a broader dialogue forum, at least, between the US and the EU. And of course, it's a bargaining chip. It would be for any US administration. I mean, why would you just lift tariffs without asking anything in return, right? And there's another issue. There's also the Boeing and Airbus related tariffs that are legal. You know, there's been a WTO ruling on it, but still it's part of the same bargain, I would argue. The question, it's not entirely clear yet what will be asked of us, but I could imagine ways of accommodating US interests. I mean, we could simply lift tariffs we have in Europe. We could have zero tariff agreements in the car industry or in other industries. Or we could have agreements on standards, on accepting standards. You know, not the full scope that were initially envisioned in the TTIP agreement, but some parts of that. And I think there's enough to talk about in a bargain, or at least in a discussion forum, and it will happen. And in terms of Biden's concessions to Warren and others, well, of course, we cannot go back to the status quo ante. I think it's been said more than a million times now that we won't get there. So we won't get to the situation in 2016 where we would very close to having a transatlantic trade agreement. But I also do think that even the left-leaning Democrats, even the Warren camp, is interested in international cooperation in trade and in having an agreement with Europe. What I do think is that they put much stronger emphasis on labor standards, on environmental standards. And, you know, we will have to discuss these issues, but I don't see in their camp, in the progressive democratic camp, I don't see people rooting against trade in general, trade agreements in general. I think it's a misconception on the European side.
Thank you. Very interesting points. Jeff, you're next. Please give us your take.
Now, you raised an interesting question, which I haven't seen any commentators in the U.S. raise yet, which is, let's assume Biden wins, and he barely wins. The left of the Democratic Party, you know, faces a choice. Do they say, oh, that would appear that what we advocate doesn't have that broad support, and we, you know, have to kind of rein in our advocacy here because we, you know, don't see a lot of support in these voting outcomes for the most progressive legislation? Or do the progressives in the Democratic Party say, see, a middle of the road guy didn't appeal enough. This is really confirmation. We should have nominated somebody else. And it's way too early to tell. But I think one of the things interesting to watch will be, how does the dynamic of this outcome play out within the Democratic Party? You know, if Biden had won in a landslide, it would have been, I mean, the progressives would have said, good, now we can do anything we want to do. But on the other hand, the moderates would have said, look, we won because we're moderate. The fact that they just barely win is going to create a different kind of dynamic inside the party.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, but let's hear from Jeff how he looks at this. Jeff, please.
Well, thank you, Reinhard, and it's an honor to be on this panel with Laura and Bruce, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to all of the listeners and viewers out there. As far as the likely outcome, I think Bruce and Laura have both covered this. I would just add maybe one or two thoughts. First, it appears likely. I would agree that that Biden will win, but of course that's not guaranteed. But if you look at Arizona and Nevada in the Southwest, and if you look at Wisconsin and Michigan in the Upper Midwest, those all seem to be trending toward Biden, and those are sufficient for him to win. So you could say that Donald Trump has built the wall, but what he did was rebuild what was referred to as the blue wall in the Upper Midwest, and he built a wall on the southern border, but it's on the Southwest, turning the Southwest Democratic. So that is an interesting path to victory if that turns out to be the case. I agree also with Bruce's assessment. We will have an extremely tight Senate. It does not really appear that the Democrats could win the Senate. The only way it could happen is if, because the Democrats have flipped 2 seats, Colorado and Arizona. The Republicans have flipped 1, Alabama, and none of the other battleground seats have flipped yet. The only one that really might is North Carolina, but even there, I think that is a long shot at this point. There will be a runoff seat in Georgia, a runoff race, at least one in Georgia, that will take place on January 5th. And you can count on an enormous amount of money being poured into that Senate runoff race. It could well dwarf what has been spent in some of these big races up to now. But even with that, it's hard to see the Democrats getting to a 50-50 split in the Senate. And then the vice president's vote, which breaks ties, would resolve it if you had a Biden presidency. So a very difficult situation in the Senate. And of course, there may also be legal challenges and recounts that will happen over the coming weeks. Just as one example, the Trump campaign apparently has said just in the last hour or so that they are calling for a recount in Wisconsin. There was a recount in Wisconsin in 2016. It really did not change much. But when you have a margin of victory, which is, I think, around 20,000 votes or something, if I'm not mistaken, you will have these kinds of challenges which could drag things out. Trump's threat this morning, when he made his unprecedented and really breathtaking claim of victory, his threat that he would take this to the Supreme Court, there is not a direct and immediate path to the Supreme Court, but it is at least possible that some of these legal challenges could get dragged out in legal battles for a while. So when you asked about the next 79 days, Reinhard, we will have these sources of uncertainty which are going to stay with us for at least into December, I would think. Now, what does all this mean for the broader picture? First, Trump did, it seems, better than expected. Of course, the final national vote tally isn't done yet, so we'll have to wait and see. But keep in mind, the projections had Biden up by about 8 points. And at least right now, it's about a 2-point difference between them. So that difference may grow. But still, there has been no repudiation of Trump or Trumpism by the American electorate in ways that that Biden and the Democratic Party were hoping for. And so the fact that Trump has outperformed the polls, I think also means that, the Republican Party is Trump's party, and Trumpism is going to live on well beyond him. I think that also means something about our models of thinking about demographic and other cleavages in the American electorate, which we clearly do not fully grasp. I'm sure Bruce could say a whole lot more about this than I could, but just as one example, there's been a lot of talk about the Latino vote, which is, I think, a misleading term, especially when you look at the results in Florida and the results in Texas and in other parts of the country. There has been a wish, I think, among some in the center left that sort of there was this demography is destiny, that American society was changing. We were progressing or moving toward a majority minority society, and that would have inevitable electoral consequences. And I don't think anybody can entertain those notions after yesterday's result, or at least of what we know of the result right now. And the bottom line for all of that is the United States remains deeply divided. And I think the president exacerbated that this morning with his premature claim of victory that is only going to raise the emotional stakes and raise the likelihood that if Biden is in the end the victor, that you will have an entire sector of the American public that will see that as somehow illegitimate. It's one of those ironies that many of Trump's supporters have spent the last 4 years accusing Democrats of failing to accept the last election outcome, and they've set themselves up to do precisely the same thing. And now the impact on governance, I think, is going to be significant. If you have a Republican Senate and a Democratic presidency, that is, of course, a recipe for gridlock, as I think both Bruce and Laura have talked about. But that will apply to cabinet appointments, where I think Biden is going to face difficulty if he is president getting nominations through the Senate. Now, of course, Trump was able to get around the problem of nominating and confirming by simply appointing people in an acting capacity. But he was able to do that only because the Senate was willing basically to indulge it. And that will be different with if you still have a Republican-controlled Senate, which appears likely. And then, of course, to say nothing about legislation, but I'll come to that a little bit when we talk about foreign policy. And by the way, just a footnote maybe, even if somehow through some dramatic turnaround, the Democrats were able to achieve a 50-50 parity in the Senate, and then you would have the vice president casting the tie-breaking vote. What that basically means is that the Biden administration could pass legislation that the most conservative Democratic senator agrees with. That's Joe Manchin of West Virginia. And that's a pretty narrow and not a very ambitious agenda when you compare that to other voices in the Democratic Party. So the idea that there might be sort of a progressive renaissance after a Biden victory, I think is completely off the table. That this would be, sort of a bit like LBJ or Franklin Roosevelt, that you might have an unleashing of pent-up reform demands that is just hard to see now. And then if I switch to the last topic you mentioned, foreign policy, I think for certain elements of foreign policy, Biden, of course, is a traditionalist. And if you read his foreign affairs article from earlier this year and look at other things he said, on those things that are wholly within the purview of the president and which also enjoy a fairly broad consensus in American politics, I think he'll be able to do a few things. NATO is the best example of that, perhaps. There is broad support in the American public for NATO among Republicans as well as Democrats. It's stronger among Democrats than among Republicans, and that difference has intensified over the years. But nevertheless, it is there. So I think a reaffirmation of the U.S. security commitment to the transatlantic community is certainly possible. I think, as Bruce said, China policy in some respects would present an area for potential forging of a common or of some common approach across the Atlantic. And more generally, the idea that there would be dialogue and agenda setting along with European partners, I think is something that would be a natural instinct of a Biden administration, regardless of the balance of power in the legislative branch. So in that sense, Biden is a multilateralist, but he is not a multilateralist, I would say, in the sense that the German government talks about multilateralism, where multilateralism is almost a sacrosanct principle rather than a way of getting things done. Biden will be a multilateralist in the sense that he will want to accomplish things. And if the multilateral or plurilateral or other arrangements that exist do not serve those purposes, he will not be willing, I think, to invest a lot of his political future on endless, recursive, and unproductive diplomatic engagement. So I would just add a note of caution there when it comes to the multilateralism. Where things get difficult is where foreign policy connects with some key element of domestic policy. And I think this has been brought up by the previous speakers, but I would frame it maybe just slightly differently. What Joe Biden has been trying to do in his campaign is to rebuild a democratic coalition that includes, among others, working class voters. And so and he will have to consolidate that after taking office if he is indeed the victor. So trade policy is not going to be a priority for a Biden administration. The idea, and I think European Commission officials have already understood this weeks ago. I remember we did an event with a senior official who involved in trade, who I think acknowledged this. But this is not going to be where there is political ground to be gained for Joe Biden, either in shoring up his domestic coalition, preparing for midterm elections in 2022, or a re-election campaign in 2024. So there is not going to be any quick trade deal with the European Union. I don't think there are going to be any quick trade deals at all if we have a Biden presidency under the circumstances as they currently appear. And so, that also applies, I think, to the steel and aluminum tariffs. I agree with Laura. There's no incentive, and there's no reason why a Biden administration is going to lift those unilaterally at an early stage without getting anything in return, because they would open themselves up to an immediate attack by the Republicans, who will say that Joe Biden is selling out American working people, regardless of the facts of the issue. And we all, the idea that those tariffs have helped American manufacturing is not credible. But as a political issue, it's extremely powerful in certain parts of the country. The last thing I would say is that the most difficult part of the agenda is going to be where it costs money to do things, or where there is legislation in place that will constrain the next administration. So Nord Stream 2, I don't see the U.S. position changing, especially if the sanctions that are currently in Congress pass during the lame duck session, as they well could, because they're part of the National Defense Authorization Act. And anything that would amount to spending money on climate change is going to be climate change initiatives. You may be able to do something on clean energy, but I think a comprehensive climate package, when the Republican Party institutionally basically rejects the idea of anthropogenic climate change, is going to be extremely difficult. So thank you for that, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you for that also, Jeff. We have heard three very clear-eyed analyses that point at sobering realities. Now I would like to bring on people that have been listening so far, and I would invite participants to send in their questions, or unless they do so, I will continue asking my own questions, which may I might start doing. I would want to come back to one question that Lava raised and that Bruce then reacted to, which is possible divisions in the Democratic camp. There's a lot of space for frustration, and that is always a good, nourishing ground for internal divisions. If you see the need to blame somebody for not achieving your goals, you might as well accuse your next neighbor, your political ally. The progressive camp in the Democratic Party might argue that they have supported Biden, well, in vain. I took note of the fact that Sanders criticized Biden twice publicly for not pushing substantive agendas more strongly. They might say we could have won better if that would have happened. So should we look forward to a stronger internal division on the Democratic Party that might hamper whatever chances are left to move anything forward? Bruce, what do you what do you say?
Well, there was this famous American comic, Will Rogers, who in the 1930s was asked about his political affiliation, and he said, "I do not belong to an organized political party. I'm a Democrat." And I think that we're about to see a very disorganized Democratic Party, or at least there's some potential for that. Because I think you're right. As we said, the progressives may draw the conclusion that we weren't progressive enough. And I was struck today in seeing two different television interviews with African-American political analysts. And they were both questioned about why African-American support for Biden was down. It wasn't as what they expected or what they hoped for or whatever. And what I found disconcerting was, in both cases, these African-American analysts, who I think are Democrats, really didn't answer the question. They went on the offensive, like they were still in the campaign. Like it's all those white people who don't understand racism in the United States and da, da, da. That wasn't the question. The question was, why is it that African Americans, at least some growing portion of African Americans, find the Trump message attractive? And that's going to take a lot of work, but I think that it would appear, at least from those two interactions, that there's going to be a lot of defensiveness here about this. Like it's not my fault that we didn't do this. And I think that for the Democrats, there should be a time of introspection here across the board. The moderates have to do some introspection about what was it about this message of kumbaya that Biden espoused that was only appealing to 19% of the American public as they talked about qualities, and what is it about the Green New Deal or things of that nature that still scared people. So but you're in politics, Reinhard, and I think you hit it on the head. It's like, it's much easier to blame somebody else than to do introspection. Introspection calls into question your deepest held beliefs, and people tend to want to defend those till their death, right?
Well, I recall 4 years ago when Democratic Washington was shell-shocked about Hillary Clinton's defeat. All my good Democratic friends wanted to inquire how they could find a new relationship with the disenfranchised, disgruntled, blue-collar workers that obviously had given Trump his margin of victory. And looking back at that 4 years later, I don't think they have made that many inroads. I don't have the impression they have figured it out. Basically, what Biden did to keep his coalition together was not talk about the issues. One of the few issues he talked about was getting out of oil and putting question marks behind fracking, and that might have cost him Pennsylvania. I mean, he stayed away from almost any of the other issues. So that's really tough. Now, we have a question here in the FNA from Antares Reich, and I read it to you. Is it likely Biden will change military doctrines in the US? For example, the drone war or the ongoing renewal of the nuclear arsenal of the US? And then I have a second question from Gunnar Jung. Given Biden wins, how long will it take before Harris takes over? Will Biden really stay around for a full term? Maybe I ask Laura to tackle the security related question, if you would, and ask Jeff to talk about Kamala. Laura?
Sure. Although I'm not much of a security policy expert, but I will give it a shot. I think there's one interesting question in this whole idea of having a policy change with Biden coming in, and that is, remarks he made about the relationship between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and Russia, and he did that recently, last week, in an interview. And I think there's a major difference between him and Trump, because what he said was essentially that China is the major competitor. I think he was referring to economic competitor, but not the main rival of the US, which Biden apparently sees in Russia rather than in Russian influence on US domestic politics rather than in Chinese activities. So it would be interesting to see how this plays out, and whether his own party would agree to that classification of, China or Russia or what else being the main rival. It certainly contradicts with what we in Europe think is a consensus, foreign policy consensus in the US, that China is the main rival, right? So yeah. Initially, you would think that there would be consistency between those two potential presidents, but maybe there's not. So that, for me, would be a major strategic question that I would like to raise with the Biden administration. In terms,
yeah,
I think if we talk about other issues like non-proliferation, it's more obvious that that Biden is the candidate who would at least give it another try, try to renegotiate New START and other agreements, and even look for further multilateral formats to control proliferation. Yeah, also approach Iran in a different way than Trump did.
Thank you. Jeff, talking about Kamala and when she takes over, I was not terribly impressed by the campaign she ran. She didn't seem to inject that much energy. She seemed more pale. What do you say?
Well, first of all, there may be a supposition in the question, but that I want to address at the start, and that is, you don't run for president in order to hand off the office to someone else. So this idea that somehow Joe Biden is going to hand over the office to Kamala Harris, it's something that was part of the Trump campaign against the Biden-Harris ticket, because they were always trying to suggest that somehow Joe Biden was a proxy for progressive, further left forces in the Democratic Party. But there's no reason to believe any of that, to state that quite clearly. And so, Joe Biden has every intention of serving, an entire term as president and probably running for re-election, as far as I know. I mean, I'm not close to the Biden campaign or to him personally, so I can't judge what's in his mind. But there's no reason to suspect that he is going to simply vacate the office. When it comes to the security questions, if I could just dwell on those for a second, because I agree with Laura that yes, I think a Biden administration would probably want to find a way at least to extend the New START treaty and then find a way to negotiate the issues that are there. They might actually try to do something like what the Trump administration wanted to do, which was expand it to include China. Maybe they would be more successful at that in some way, but I don't think there's going to be a fundamental change in the nuclear weapons policy of the United States government under a Biden administration, if that's what people might have in mind, thinking if you were looking at this from kind of a European perspective. I don't think that is likely. I think what you are probably likely to see from a Biden administration that might actually be a sort of continuity to a Trump administration is actually restraint in the use of force internationally. Biden was always among the most reluctant in the Obama administration when it came to employing force. And while, yes, going further back, he had been a supporter of the Iraq War, I think if you look more recently at the things he's actually done and observing that one element of Trump's foreign policy that did have a fair amount of support was keeping the United States out of major foreign military engagements. So I think that would likely come through.
Thank you, Jeff. That basically brings us to the end. There is one third question that I would read, and maybe Bruce, you can give a fast answer. Somebody writes, Tilkata writes, I like your optimism that Biden still wins. What if Trump will insist with his assault on the election? How should European partners react during the next weeks to assure a regular outcome? Give me a 1 minute question to that, 1 minute answer to that, Bruce, please.
Look, I think there's very little the Europeans can do. I mean, they certainly can encourage the United States to follow its constitutional processes and remind Americans that the world is watching. But at the end of the day, Americans, frankly, based on polling data we know, don't really care what the rest of the world thinks of the United States. They have this perception about how popular we are outside, and so I mean, it underscores the fact that we are the most powerful country in the world, and we get to elect the most powerful person in the world, and nobody else gets a vote. And there's an inherent inequality there and unfairness, but it is what it is. And so but I would encourage Europeans to speak loudly and clearly about this, because obviously the outcome of this election affects Europeans' interests.
Thank you. I want to thank all three of my panelists. I think you've done a stellar job. You've been giving us very, very valuable insights. If I would sum it all up with 5 simple sentences, the US is obviously a deeply divided country without anybody yet offering a way out, and the support for the kumbaya approach is less than 1/5. Trumpism is there to stay. There is no progressive renaissance, and Europeans shouldn't expect that the United States will fulfill their foreign policy related or transatlantic dreams. The one positive that we should not forget, though, is chances are Trump is gone as president for a while. So thank you very much for your contributions, Laura, Bruce, Jeff. Appreciate that a lot. And thanks to all the listeners. Wish you a good evening or good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me. And for the
Thank you.
among us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.